Can I just thank Tim for inviting me to this? This is a wonderful series. And being an optimist, a young Australian optimist, I have actually a bit of a mixture of background of climate science and economics. And when I pursued writing this book, I started a couple of years ago. We were in a very different state of thinking in Australia. But the world really, despite what you think about what's happened in Copenhagen, is going through a revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution that we know of started in the 18th century, and really it has grown a wonderful array of new technologies and grown our prosperity. And so millions of different technologies have been promoted and expanded to grow our standard of living. But in the Industrial Revolution, when we actually had economic growth or production, we were necessarily going to emit a lot of greenhouse gases because we linked our prosperity to a couple of main sources of energy, meaning being coal and oil, which are carbon-intense forms of energy. Now, over the last 10-odd years, we have seen a tremendous shift towards a new type of prosperity, a prosperity which is pollution-free, low-carbon, clean technology. Now, Grant was talking mainly about energy, but our entire society is built on not only energy, the actual generation of energy that we power at the power plants, but also the buildings we build, the materials that go into the buildings, the fuels we drive our cars, the trains, the planes, the type of cities we design. Now, so this clean industrial revolution that I'm talking about is not just energy itself. It's actually a new prosperous form of a new low-carbon form of prosperity, which covers all of what we do in our society. Because it's not just going to be the generation sources of energy that are going to have to change. It's actually the technologies that we use that will also have to change. And this is what this clean industrial revolution is all about. Now, the central thesis of this book, and what I really want to have been travelling in Australia trying to promote, is Australia's role in this new world. Now, Australia's role, we are on shaky grounds. And the reason we are on shaky grounds is because we are carbon obese, and I term the phrase carbon obese. We are the most coal-dependent nation, both for energy supply as well as how we export to the world. So because we are carbon obese, in a world that is starting to value carbon, we have a very huge economic exposure to that. Now, I'll give you just an example of what I mean. So in terms of carbon, if the world is valuing carbon, they're going to shift to low-carbon resources and energy supplies. One example is Google. Now, we all know Google from their massive new solar installations and all sorts of wonderful stuff they're doing in California. But they're a global company, and they have global reach, and they need these things called data centers. Data centers are these, you probably know them, $500 million installations full of just spinning racks and hard drives, and they need a lot of energy. Now, Google in 2007, before any carbon legislation was formulated in the United States, we said we're going to go carbon neutral, and we are going to price carbon. We're going to price pollution on these investments. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that actually means that when they spot and when they make decisions to go around the world to build these new massive installations which grow jobs, they're going to low-carbon hubs. They're going to places which have base low-carbon resources, whether it be hydro, geothermal, biomass, solar thermal in some cases in India. They are shifting their company and investment decisions to low-carbon hubs. Now, in Australia, we talk about carbon leakage, right? We talk about, it's going to be a hindrance to our economic prosperity if we actually value carbon, because everyone's going to move to China. Well, actually, in the new world, there's going to be low-carbon floods to those nations who embrace this challenge and actually reduce their carbon exposure. So that's one example of how we as Australians are sensitive to the new world. And since I wrote this book it was published last year, a lot of things have happened, as you know, and the ETS, or the ETS shelving, is an absolute, not only is it a moral and environmental failure, as we all know, it is an economic failure. Because as we can see from what Grant was talking about, if you don't have a carbon price in your economy, you are not going to drive the investment decisions that are needed for us to shift away from our carbon obesity. And so I coined also the phrase in the book, accidental environmentalists. Now, an accidental environmentalist is someone like Gordon Gekko. You know, Gordon Gekko on Wall Street, right? He may have a different moral compass to you and I, but Gordon Gekkos make decisions based on profit. If there is no carbon price in an economy, if we don't value carbon, there is no incentive for Gordon Gekko to be an accidental environmentalist and invest in clean technology and invest in the space we need to invest. Because it's not just a government. We don't live in a government-run society. Remember, the government they should inform us in terms of legislation, but it's the market that drives that change. And actually, if you look around the world, the market is shifting rapidly towards this clean industrial revolution. One final stat is that, to give you some optimism, is that in 2008, the first time ever, new investment in global energy globally was tracked, and renewables beat coal and gas in new investment for the first time by 30%, by the way, and that hasn't changed. That is going up. So the new world, the new economic prosperity is not in the old way of doing things. As Obama said this year, Obama said that the nation that leads the global clean energy economy is going to be the nation that leads the global economy. That's not some loopy outward guy out there. This is President Obama. So I struggle to see how our Prime Minister and our political leaders can't see this as an actual economic imperative as well as a moral environmental one. So I guess I'm done now. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks a lot for that.
Thanks very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As mentioned, I'm here tonight representing Siemens. We're a multinational company, German-based, who produce products and services across the whole energy chain, from oil and gas, from wind, solar, all the way through to consumption. What I would like to do, I think, is I'll draw on some of the technology examples in a little discussion I'd like to have just for 5 minutes. In Australia, we've spent about 12 months now doing a study on what the future of energy may look like in this country. And this country is fairly unique in that we have many more choices and options than nearly every other country in the world. And in some ways, that's almost a problem for us in terms of what we do. So we have very, very cheap energy based on fossils, and yet as a nation, we've set ourselves some quite difficult targets in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. And as a company working in the energy sector, we decided to look what the future of this energy sector would look like. I guess in some ways, selfishly, we wanted to drive our business strategy. And reiterating on some of the points Grant made earlier on, when you look at the targets we have, and they're mentioned in the newspapers every day, we have a target of 5% reduction for 2020. Sounds easy. And 60% by 2050. Now, the only problem is that by 2050, our population from the year 2000, which is the baseline, will have gone up by 75%. So that's a very challenging energy reduction or CO2 reduction number that we have. And even the 5%, when you look at where we will be if we keep doing nothing by 2020, I think Grant mentioned 45%, and that correlates well with our numbers. So what do? We looked at what the future of the energy sector might look like, and one of the things we found was that the driving paper, the driving research for the ETS, which never got passed, was a very interesting piece of research, and it showed, or it postulated that the best way for Australia to achieve our targets would be to physically achieve around 50% of the required reductions by 2050, and the other 50% would be achieved by buying CO2 certificates from overseas at a cost in 2050 of around $23 billion per annum. Now, as an engineering company, as simple engineers, we thought that didn't sound like a very good deal. So we decided to have a look at this and see if we could come up with a better approach. And what we've found, we've developed what we call a technology blueprint for achieving our greenhouse gas emission targets by 2050. And it's a complex thing, and we certainly don't have time to go into the detail here, but it really covers 5 key areas. One is continuing use of fossil power generation, but with carbon capture storage. And we think carbon capture storage will become commercially viable somehow by around 2020. Strong growth in renewables. Grant spoke a lot about wind. We're building large-scale solar, thermal, and PV power stations around the world right now. It's viable technology. We talked about smart grid. Certainly our view on smart grid is that in the future, the grid will be a key management tool for managing these intermittent energy flows from production to consumption and back again. Electrified transportation. If we're to achieve our goals by 2050, the only way we can achieve it, or one of the key pieces of this platform, is to electrify road transportation. That has impact on smart grid as well. And finally, to aggressively attack energy efficiency. And I think, coming back to Grant's point, I think our view is one that says really, we believe the technology is there now and will only improve into the future. And much of the technology has a return on investment of less than a year or sometimes shorter at today's very, very low energy prices. I think our challenge, to hark back to Grant's words, is to put in place frameworks, legislative and regulatory frameworks, which drive cultural change in our population in order to actually achieve those energy reductions which are possible. And really, I think that's the key message from our framework. We're a bunch of technologists. We've worked out a way to achieve those goals that we have. And like any model, I think the old classic for modelers is, the first thing about a model before you start is that it will be wrong. And our model is, we think, a reasonable model, but it's probably wrong in some ways. But it shows a technology map to 2050, which says we as a nation could achieve our goals. But we have to start now. And really, I think the key messages from Grant, we would only reiterate, we have to start now if we have any chance of achieving those goals. And our message is to the regulators and the legislators that unless we put in place the right political and regulatory framework to drive investments in the sorts of technologies that we're talking about, we will not achieve those goals. And we can stop fooling ourselves today. I think that's...
Michael, I don't want you to sit down just yet. I just want you to very quickly tell me a little bit about Siemens and Desertec, and a little about Siemens and some of the work that you're doing in terms of new infrastructure that's going to help in terms of emissions reduction.
Okay, certainly. Desertec is a program or even a company now set up in Europe, the Middle East, and part of the Middle East and North Africa, looking at harnessing the renewable energy capacities available in Northern Africa and the Middle East in terms of wind and solar, and connecting a series of large-scale wind and solar power stations to a high-voltage DC transmission network, which will then transmit power to Europe. The expectation is that by 2050, around 25 to 30% of Europe's electrical energy needs could be provided by the Desertec scheme. Siemens is one of the foundation members of Desertec, so we're certainly looking at bringing our technology into play, whether that's wind turbine technology, whether it's large-scale solar technology, or the high-voltage DC transmission technology required to efficiently transmit energy long distances. We think one of the interesting applications of that sort of technology is to Australia, and we can see a future in Australia where the east and west coasts of this country, which are currently not connected electrically, could be connected by a high-voltage DC transmission network with a series of solar, geothermal and wind power stations feeding into that network as you move across the country. That becomes a very interesting concept in addressing some of the intermittency issues that Grant raised earlier, where in this country currently we have 4 peaks in the course of a day, 2 on the east coast and 2 on the west coast. With the sun moving across the continent and a series of solar power stations across the continent, you're able to cover 2 of those 4 peaks with solar energy. That becomes a very interesting energy management concept for the future. And those are examples of the sort of technologies that Siemens is working on right now globally. And another example, we're just in the throes of commissioning the largest HVDC link in the world. It's a 4,000 megawatt, that's 2 Luoyangs, 4,000 megawatt, 1,500 kilometre, 800,000 volt high voltage DC transmission line. It will take the energy generated by a remote hydro power station in China to a large industrial city. It will do it at half the losses of classical AC transmission technology. That technology is available today. Coming back to Grant's points, we have to start now. The technology is available today, but we need the regulatory environment to do it in.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, and good evening, everybody. Just a couple of sentences about Tata Power. We are a part of what is called the Tata Group in India, which is arguably the most highly respected business group in India. And the Tata Group is promoted by a company, a privately held company called Tata Sons, which is very unique because 65% of its equity is held by charitable trusts. And this happened way back 140 years ago when this group was founded, and the founder, Jamshedji Tata, said that we have to give back to the community what we take from them. So that's been, in many ways, a driving philosophy of the group. And around 1890, one of the businesses that the founder, Jamshedji Tata, wanted to get into was power. And the reason he gave at that time was that he wanted cheap, abundant, and clean power to be delivered to the citizens of Bombay, as it was known then. And therefore, he was, in many ways, 120 years ahead of his time. He started off by putting up hydroelectric power plants. And despite the fact that the Indian government for almost a century did not allow private sector to grow in the energy field, in the electricity field, we grow very, very slowly. And till 2003, we had only a generation of about 2,000 megawatts. But after 2003, the situation has changed, the Electricity Act has been modified, and the government has opened it up. And just to give you a feel of the environment we work in, India, even during the worst part of the financial crisis, grew at over 6% GDP. Last year, it was over 7%. This year, it's predicted to be 8.5%. And unless we shoot ourselves many times in the foot, I think that kind of growth will continue for the next 5 or 6 years at least. Which means, of course, no surprises, energy, electricity. And we ourselves have set ourselves a target of growing 10 times to a size of 25,000 megawatts generation alone. We are in other businesses as well, by 2017, so 10 times in 10 years. The bad news is that initially we will have to grow largely in coal. We have our generation today about 35% in coal, and the rest spread out between gas, oil, wind, etc. But about 4 years ago, when we sat down to put down our strategy blueprint, we identified sustainability as being a core pillar that we would work on. And we realized that if businesses themselves don't take upon this task without necessarily having the support of government, we're not going to get anywhere. And when we set out this target, we also set forth what we called, a little pompously, the eightfold path of sustainability, where we talked about emissions control, about waste reduction, about water consumption coming down, about all our new buildings being green buildings, about renewables. And we said that we identified 3 areas where we would grow in renewables: in wind, in geothermal, and in solar, because these are the most appropriate for India, and we believe that through technology and scale, we'll be able to bring down the costs. We also talked about technology and how we would link up with startup companies, bringing in new technologies in these areas. We, in fact, have, along with Grant, an equity holding in geodynamics in Australia. We also further said that India has a huge challenge of development, but we have over 400 million people in the countryside who do not have access to electricity. So can we continue the same Western model of development? And somebody calculated that if India and China does that, we will need somewhere between 6 and 8 Earths, which clearly is unsustainable. So here is a huge opportunity for India, and huge opportunity commercially for many companies in India, of actually coming up with a development path which is sustainable for the rural areas of India, which would be distributed generation, which would be small, appropriate forms of energy, and something which will require a partnership between large business, government, financial institutions, and NGOs. So we, on the one hand, put up a 4,000 megawatt coal-based power plant. On the other hand, we put up a 250 kilowatt agri-mass gasification unit out in the villages. And we're also working now with some other parties where we set up agri-mass-based residue gasification plants for telecom towers. Now, that's a commercial proposal. But we also have oversized it so that we can supply the excess electricity to the nearby villages. And we're also talking to NGOs and financial institutions to see if we can actually have clusters of villages, which can then be green villages through appropriate agricultural practices, through appropriate forms of energy, and creating business hubs in these villages. So there are a whole series of areas that we've got into. We are in wind. We have 200 megawatts of wind. We're growing every year at about 100 to 150 megawatts extra. We're in solar. We have a joint venture. Now, don't shout. We have a joint venture with BP called Tata BP Solar in this field. We are setting up our first 3 megawatt grid-connected power plant in the next 2 months, jumping straight to 25 thereafter by next year, and another 50 megawatts the year after. Geothermal, we are working in Australia, and we're also looking at Indonesia and seeing whether we can participate in that development there and back in India. We're looking at agri-based residues and so on. So I'd just like to end by saying that, when I said that industry has to take the lead, and I really firmly believe that, with a little story, if you don't mind, Nick, which goes back to the founder of India, of modern India, and that is Mahatma Gandhi. There was this mother who took a child to see him because she said, he keeps on eating sweets, and whatever I say, he stops. Asking him to stop, he refuses to stop, and he's having all kinds of problems in his teeth. And in the ashram, she went up to Bapuji, as he was called, and said, Bapuji, please, you advise him. He'll listen to you. So Bapuji just smiled and said, come back in a week. So she said, okay, if that's the way. Then she waited a week and then took him again. And then he sat down and talked to him and told him about the ill effects of eating sweets, etc., and extracted a promise from him to be careful. So she turned around to him and said, but Bapuji, you could have said that 1 week ago. Why did you wait? So he said, but I went off sweets for this last 1 week. And therefore, I have to be the change that I propound. And I think that is the role of business and industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prasad. We've got 25 minutes. We want this Q&A session to be dynamic. I think that is the key word. I've got a whole lot of questions that were elicited during the very tight break, following on from what Grant has said. But of course, if we just do those questions, it disenfranchises you from actually asking questions of the other presenters. So we also want to take questions from the floor also. So if you do want to ask a question, I would like it to be a question. I would like it to be pertinent to what you've just heard, and I do not want any speeches or you sharing with us what you believe is as important or possibly more important than what you've heard from our fine panel. But there are very few perks once a lecture series starts for the curator of a lecture series, and we worried about that, and we thought, well, what perk can we possibly give Tim Flannery? And the perk that he gets is the ability to ask the first question. Tim.
I'd just like to thank you, Grant, for an excellent keynote, and to our panel for just the most fantastic input into this very, very difficult problem. I'd like to just stretch you all a little bit and take you back to the basic climate science, to the sort of things that James Hansen has been saying, that to keep our planet safe from dangerous climate change, we'll need to phase out the conventional burning of coal by 2030. And just to ask you, if that became a national imperative in each of your jurisdictions, how would you like to see us go about achieving that particular kind of goal?
Ben.
I think I'm an academic, it's easy for me to answer that. Yeah. No. Well, I think there's a few things that would be needed. The first is, as we talked, something where some leadership in terms of carbon targets, that is ambitious ones, because although I have a lot of respect for Grant, I think we can do a lot better than 5%. And the reason I say that is because if you look elsewhere around the world, what countries have done in 10 years, we're talking about a large change in terms of emissions. But secondly, aside from that, which has the carbon price element to it, which is important, is about research and development. This enormous upswing that we need in Australia, in particular, into clean forms of energy and clean coal, if that's possible.
I actually believe that one of the absolute core technologies going forward is HVDC technology, because a generation ago we put transmission into our coal fields and connected our coal fields, and that's what our current generation of technology is based upon. But the low emissions resources are almost certainly not where our current transmission systems are. So I'm not sure it's right to say at the moment that it's going to be solar thermal or geothermal or any of those choices, but at the centre of our future choices is going to be very cost-effective transmission of energy. So I actually think HVDC technology is quite central to the future solutions, but what they'll be connecting, I think we'll be surprised about.
Yep. And Michael, presumably you're going to say yes, and you have business cards available, and please have a look at this website.
I think the comment I would make, Nick, is that we've certainly looked at that sort of concept where in Australia we have these massive resources of renewable energy, as long as we can tap into them technologically, and as Grant says, that mix will be somebody's choice later in the future. I think in terms of a link, for example, a HVDC link through Papua New Guinea to Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, is certainly something people can envisage today. I mean, we built the longest undersea HVDC link in the world, which connects Victoria to Tasmania. The sea distances to link parts of Southeast Asia together are longer than that, so we would need to develop some technologies in terms of lengths of transmission, but it's certainly a technology that you would think over the next 20 to 30 years would and could be developed.
David Miliband has essentially articulated in the UK context, which of course is different, as all contexts are, that there will be no new coal-fired power stations, I think by 2020 in the UK, without some form of carbon capture and sequestration technology involved in them. It's a slightly different approach, but I suppose I just sort of, in response really to your question, before throwing to Grant, to his response to the question, is that there are ways in which clear signals can be given about the nature of the transition required. Grant, did you want to respond?
Yeah, my answer shouldn't surprise Tim. Look, the half of the equation we don't talk about is who's going to pay for this. At the end of the day, consumers will end up paying for it. They're going to buy the energy. So you have to have that side of it in the discussion. And when you have that side of the discussion in the business we're in, you're telling people their power bills are going to go up and electricity bills going up doesn't generate a whole lot of enthusiasm. So I can't ignore that side of the equation. Now, when I consider that side of the equation, we must be committed to the least cost way of achieving that reduction. And I'm dead against anybody picking in advance the way to do that in terms of a technology or a solution, because what we will be surprised about is how many different ways this can be solved, provided we give a target and a price signal. But the target oughtn't be no coal. The target ought to be how much carbon reduction we want by what point in time, and we ought to be absolutely committed to that system or process that brings that about at the lowest possible cost, because it's everybody in this room that will end up paying for it. So that's the way I would say we have to work towards it.
Thank you, Grant. That's the curatorial question answered, I think. I'd encourage people, if they do have questions, to make their way to the microphone there in the corner, or equivalently to the microphone down here. The level of dynamism and energy and indeed physical force used by the man at the front here is impressive. But relax, because Twitter has come to our aid, and I have a whole series of questions here which I'm going to go to before we go to you first, man with black shirt and brown top. You were first, you were second, and you were third. Oh, okay. Well, I'll leave you to sort that out amongst yourselves. And then we'll go to the microphone at the back. So the first question from the floor will be from you and then from you. But before then, I suppose this is really a question, rather than going to everybody, I hope people will allow me the license simply to go to people who I think this question is most relevant to. They won't only always be for Grant, but a question I think first to Grant, and then maybe if you'd like to comment, Michael, is a question from Andrew Jennings, which is, do you think that Desertec type solutions are appropriate for Australia? For example, links with large solar thermal power stations in Broken Hill or the Pilbara. I'm not sure if you've done the analysis on that, Andrew, but Grant, would you care to respond?
Yeah, look, I'll try and keep the answers quick. I actually believe that one of the absolute core technologies going forward is HVDC technology, because a generation ago we put transmission into our coalfields and connected our coalfields, and that's what our current generation of technology is based upon. But the low emissions resources are almost certainly not where our current transmission systems are. So I'm not sure it's right to say at the moment that it's going to be solar thermal or geothermal or any of those choices, but at the centre of our future choices is going to be very cost-effective transmission of energy. So I actually think HVDC technology is quite central to the future solutions, but what they'll be connecting, I think we'll be surprised about.
Yep. And Michael, presumably you're going to say yes, and you have business cards available, and please have a look at this website.
I think the comment I would make, Nick, is that we've certainly looked at that sort of concept where in Australia we have these massive resources of renewable energy, as long as we can tap into them technologically, and as Grant says, that mix will be somebody's choice later in the future. I think in terms of a link, for example, a HVDC link through Papua New Guinea to Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia is certainly something people can envisage today. I mean, we built the longest undersea HVDC link in the world, which connects Victoria to Tasmania. The sea distances to link parts of Southeast Asia together are longer than that, so we would need to develop some technologies in terms of lengths of transmission, but it's certainly a technology that you would think over the next 20 to 30 years would and could be developed.
Thank you very much, Michael. I've just remembered another rule which I haven't articulated, which is no acronyms in Q&A sessions before they're actually described in English. So could you tell me what HVDC stands for? I know, but maybe others don't.
HVDC is high voltage direct current, and it is a transmission technology which is slightly more complex and expensive than the current AC, alternating current transmission technologies we use, but results in losses that are significantly less, around half on average.
Thank you very much, Michael, for clarifying that. Now we go to the man who's brandishing a mobile phone. I hope it's turned off. I hope it's turned off. Your question, and remember, I want it to be a question, I want it to be directed to someone on the platform, and I want it to be pertinent to what we've heard.
Thank you. My name is Richard Yanieri. I'm a local member of a tribe in plague proportions. We keep talking about the dollar. Why is it that we keep talking about that very primitive measure of exchange currency when we could probably be talking about a base specific measure such as, in this case, energy units? Why don't we do that? And why do we always keep talking about the dollar? Is that the only way to generate a solution?
I think we did talk about some other metrics as well as dollars, but Grant, do you want to have a first go at responding to that?
Well, I think I in part addressed that previously, that at the end of the day, all of this discussion manifests in the bills you receive every month or every quarter. And it's the customers that ultimately talk about the dollars. I mean, customers are going to be given choices. They've got choices now. We offer customer choices, for example, to buy green energy, to buy what we call black energy, normal energy, if you like, and some exercise that choice. But at the end of the day, the two bookends is what customers are willing to pay and what capital has to be invested to bring about a change. And at the end of the day, those two have to meet. I mean, that capital has to be funded, sourced and serviced by customers. And that's the facts of it. I mean, intermediaries sit in the middle and build any form of current or new technology to supply the energy we want, and that has to be funded and it's paid for by customers. So, we tend to use dollars, but at the end of the day, these assets don't emerge for anything other than the capital investment that we need to make in building them.
Ben, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I did. Just the debate in Australia and around the world is really polarised, and it comes back to the age-old Neanderthal thinking that it's the economy or the environment, or it's the economy or society. You know, there's a net negative impact on the environment if you increase economic growth or vice versa, which that is really archaic thinking. The environment and the economy are absolutely intertwined. Now, in a future world where you have potentially 9 billion people, that's even more paramount in terms of the economic, the economic vision, if you will. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been locked into nothingness in Australia for a long time, is that exact view that if we do something for carbon, it means that we're going to go back to the caves. Now, that's just sort of lunacy, really, and it doesn't help, because actually, if you view what's happening around the world, I sort of view Australia as this typewriter economy in a digital age that the world's moving to, you know, iPads and PCs, and we're just standing here waiting for this new world to emerge, while we could be embracing it, because we have the innovation, we have all the things required, as everyone's been talking about, to create that and drive that new world, irrespective of how many emissions we have from a sort of global perspective. But that's an important question, the economy versus the environment, and I think it's just, we need to break that bounds.
And one thing I would say, not for a sort of flagrant plug, but Tim Jackson, who's written a terrific book called Prosperity Without Growth, will be talking here on Wednesday evening about many of these questions about how we use GDP and other measures in order to actually communicate what prosperity is all about. And he very articulately challenges that in what I think is an excellent book. Can we go to the man in the dapper suit next to the microphone there?
Thank you, Nick. My question is to Mr. King. Mr. King told us how difficult it would be under business as usual to have a 5% cut by 2020. But I see the problem with the framing of this debate is that we're putting narrow boundaries around the debate. The very keynote address said how difficult it was if Origin remained in business in 2020. And so my question is, when is it going to be that we're able to look outside the box for solutions and invite suggestions from community groups that have worked hard to add suggestions? Nick, you seem to keep the debate and the question time very close, very tied down, which is fine, but there is a problem and we need to open up this box a little bit.
And what was the question? I mean, I'll take it as a statement if you like.
Well, how can we open up the box?
Well, ask a question.
Well, Mr. King, why didn't you mention concentrated solar thermal in your factoring for your transition to the future, for example?
Well, that's one question. Grant.
Yeah, I don't think... if you talk about opening up the box, I think the fundamentally interesting question you always come back to is what most opens up the box. And there's a philosophical debate you can have at the core as to whether people respond to, to what sort of signals. Now, one of the very significant debates in society is whether those signals are regulatory, someone else makes the choice for us, or they're driven by choices and incentives and choices. All we would argue for is that if you establish a value in doing something, you will be staggered at how many good solutions come forward. And solar thermal or any of the other technologies will all sit in that context. This debate, when you look at it from where we look at it, is characterised by a lot of special pleading. Everybody's got their favoured solution and wants their favoured solution mandated from a regulatory perspective. And I have to say one thing I feel very strongly is that relying on governments or anybody to choose what the right technology or the right answer is would be a poor decision. So, yeah, there is a philosophical debate to have, but if you want to ask me what most opens up the box, it's to give us simply a signal that the box should be open, that is, we need a scheme, and a price. What value is there in changing the way that we operate? Every choice you then want will come into play. Every technology that you could hope or dream of will come into play, and you'll be stunned at how many different solutions will come on the table.
I think, Grant, if I can add something to that as well, from a constructor and a technology provider's perspective, we see this maybe from a slightly different perspective, and that is we see the problems that our customers have when they have a project, whatever the technology, of building that project when they don't have some sort of certainty of revenue streams into the future. Because most of these projects are built by big banks lending companies money to build a project that generates electricity for the next 25, 30 years. And those projects often are worth billions of dollars. Banks don't lend money for projects worth that sort of money unless they've got some sort of surety that the person who owns the project will be able to pay the interest on the loan every month or every week or whatever it is. So those sorts of issues, I think, are very easy to forget or gloss over in enthusiasm about let's find the next really nice solution. The reality is we live in a business world and there are significant issues to be addressed in coming to an energy economy which looks very different to the one we have today.
Thanks, Michael. Gentleman at the front in the blue T-shirt.
Okay, so, look, I'd be interested in asking Grant King whether, given that Origin formerly Boral Gas and your history as an AGL gas guy, whether you've decided to continue your company's path of exploiting gas and creating, being part of the 15 LNG trains that are being developed in Queensland, or whether your company could look at modelling the potential of becoming a big player in baseload solar thermal, like the $20 billion of plants that are currently under construction in Spain today, that were otherwise ignored by your discussion when you claimed that geothermal, not yet ready, is the only baseload solution available. Now, that's completely untrue, and I don't understand whether you just missed it or whether you know about it and you decided not to tell us.
Grant, to be fair, I think you've partially answered that question already, but if you want to give it another go.
Yeah, look, I doubt whether there's a company in Australia that spent more on solar. We spent $100 million on solar photovoltaic research now for more than 10 years.
100 million, we're talking 20 billion in construction in Spain. There's a bit of an order of magnitude. Yeah, and none of that came to fruition.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd hold the Spanish economy up as...
It's been funded by European banks, not by the Spanish people, because it's a feed-in tariff. They pay in the future. They built them like this year, last year, and they haven't paid for them. So that didn't have anything to do with the death of the Spanish economy, which is due to a massive global financial crisis and the crash of the property market. It had nothing to do with feed-in tariffs for solar thermal plants.
Yeah, they will all of these investments will need to be paid for, and the answer really quite simply goes back to yourselves and what you want to pay. If Australia chose, apart from all of the technical issues, to want to have an entirely solar future, it could choose to do so, and it would simply need to pay what it wanted to pay. And that's a choice that's available to you as a community.
But with 70%
Thank you. That's your question. And there's a gentleman over there in the blue top with the white shirt just sticking over it.
Yes, I'd like to ask...
Can I just ask your name? Sorry, I should have done that with you as well.
Ford, and I'd like to ask, how can the customers, the ordinary rank-and-file customers, have a proper influence other than by smart meters? Now, smart meters can either be smart from the distribution company's point of view, that is, they permit easy disconnection and you have to pay your bill or zap, or they can be smart from the customer's point of view, which means that the customer knows how much per kilowatt hour as of now. Thank you.
That's quite a clear question. Michael, can you have a go at that, given all the effort that Siemens puts into developing smart meters, and then I think we're going to go to Grant again.
Sure. I think the smart meters and their real impact on energy usage is an interesting one. And there have been a number of studies done globally on what actually happens. And it's actually an unfortunate part of psychology that people will do things for a little while it's new, and then their reduction in energy usage tapers off. That's just one point to start with. But I think the second point would be a smart meter in your meter box probably doesn't help very much. And again, from overseas, what is seen is that a smart meter with technology that allows you to see what your current energy usage is right now becomes a much more interesting thing, and unfortunately in the Victorian smart meter rollout we don't really have that capacity yet. I think in our view the end game though in smart meters is a situation, and again the technology exists essentially today, is where your smart meter will, at 6 p.m. tonight, recognise that the pool price is at the highest it's been all night and will turn your refrigerator off for an hour. If your refrigerator's off for an hour, that won't hurt you or your family, and it will turn it back on again at 7 o'clock when the pool price comes low. That sort of technology with smart metering we see as being a future which, as Grant mentioned earlier on, allows better scheduling of time of use of energy. So while it doesn't reduce the amount of energy used, you get that by having a nice, very efficient fridge. What you can do is reduce your energy bill because you're only using energy when it's cheaper, and you're assisting the rest of the energy economy in having a well-utilised generation and transmission asset. Is that I'm sorry if that got a little bit complicated, but I think in terms of the technology and smart meters in houses, I think they're the issues. Grant, if you'd like to add to that at all.
Thanks, Michael. Grant, I'm reminded of one of the points that you made about nice thing to do, important thing to do, but is this actually going to achieve the reductions that we need? Maybe that's a lead into your response.
Remember, my comments are in the context of by 2020.
Yeah, by 2020.
Yeah. Look, I think Michael's described the smart metering technology at its best. It gives people information and they can make choices based on that information.
Okay, thank you. I'm just conscious of time. It's 29 minutes past 7. I recognise that there have been grand physical feats by people down here in running shoes, and there's also a woman over there who's been extremely patient. And what I would propose is, can we take 2 questions, and then I'll then go back to the panel, and then I will say a few words, and then we can all go home into the Melbourne night. First here, I'm going to take that question, and then I'm going to take your question. So can I have a question from the gentleman here? And your name?
John Anthony Patterson. So guys, why do you think the world leaders who were very, had good intentions, got railroaded by Russia and China and possibly lobby groups in their campaigns to bring about this important change which we need?
Thank you, that's very clear. The woman in the green.
My name is Helen Cavnudius. My question is perhaps business part of the problem? Why do we have this divide of producer and consumer? Why can't the consumer also be a producer? Why can't we, as consumers, also be connected to the grid, have our own solar panels or other efficiency or other modes of electricity production in our homes, and actually be part of the solution rather than the payer of or the consumer of the energy produced by big business?
Helen, thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time. Prasad, can I ask you to respond to Helen's point particularly, and then I'm going to go along the panel to respond to either Helen's point or indeed to the whole point about the dynamics behind the geopolitical response. Prasad.
Yeah, the clear answer to a question is yes, of course it's possible. But it does depend on policy. And we are fortunate that in India just 3 months ago, they've come out with a new policy on not just grid-connected solar power, but also distributed solar power on roofs and so on. So that clearly now opens up a huge new opportunity, not just for setting up these systems, but for consumers to then say, okay, declare independence from the grid.
Okay.
And I think in many ways, not just in urban areas in India, but in rural areas, this is going to happen.
Ben?
I just wanted to address this question. I think that it's one thing to say there's something meaningful being done globally relevant to scientific targets, as opposed to something that's being meaningfully done just generally, because the scientific targets, we're definitely not there.
Well,
so in terms of the Copenhagen, I think there's been a lot of dour mood of what happened at Copenhagen, but a lot of good things happened. And the thing for me that really stands out that not many people really picked up on was President Obama's speech at Copenhagen, when he said that essentially the United States is going to reduce carbon, put an ETS, a carbon price into legislation in the coming years and reduce carbon by 80% by 2050. But he said that we're going to do this independent of what anyone else does. We're doing this out of self-interest. We see that creating a new economy in the United States is going to have all the, going to create all those low-carbon, clean technology businesses that the world is going to crave. He actually gets it. He gets that it's not only just an environmental and moral issue, it's actually a hugely economic one. So for us in Australia to sit back and view this in different terms, I think is actually very unfortunate.
Thanks, Ben. Michael, if you'd just like to quickly respond. I'm just conscious of time. I've given myself 5 minutes over, but 5 minutes is all it will be. We've got about 1 minute and 20 seconds. Michael. To either of the two questions, the whole division between...
I might choose the technology one, given that's my role here.
Yeah,
but certainly, I think, in line with Prasad, the technology is around. Certainly, you would say historically in Australia there has been some reticence to allow people to generate at home. That's certainly changing. Mm-hmm. I think that will change dramatically in the next few years. I think one comment I will make, and it seems to me the obvious one, and that is in terms of small to medium scale solar. We have a lot of governments in this country with very generous feed-in tariffs for residential solar, when in terms of the country, an efficiency of investment of capital for the country, it's not a very good deal. We should be doing more large-scale solar. The efficiency of investment you get is much, much better. So while small-scale residential solar is a great thing in terms of changing the culture of people and making them more aware of energy issues, we talked about that a moment ago as well, that's great. But I'd ask you to think about the strict economics of having PV cells on people's houses. It's not as good as having them on warehouses and factories. And yet we have no feed-in tariffs for warehouses and factories.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to give licence the final word to our keynote speaker. Grant, did you want to just quickly respond, and then we'll wrap up the evening?
I'm not sure my word should be the final word, Nick, but
well,
just in respect to the two questions, and I'll address a slightly different aspect around large producers. At the end of the day, 20, 30, 40, 50, the role that transmission and distributions play in our energy systems will be vastly different. So today we connect a few points of production with many points of consumption. In the future we'll connect many points of production with many points of consumption, and many of those production points will be on your Westfield shopping centres and your factories and your rooftops. But what we do need is the technology to do that, and the companies that provide that technology need large resources to invest in the R&D to do that. So you might say, well, why do we need large producers to supply us energy? Large somethings will develop the technology, whether it's on your rooftop or in your yard, whether it's a small micro turbine, whether it's a solar PV unit, whether it's solar thermal. All of those technology choices do require substantial resources to develop and does take substantial lead time. So the pattern of things will change, and it will change dramatically. If I did have a final message, one ought to be immensely hopeful of what can be achieved, because you will be stunned at the sort of technical innovation that is and can occur, but it does take lots of time and resources to implement it, and it does need a signal to say this is what society values and what we want to do, and that signal ultimately comes from you.
Grant, thank you very much. I suppose my final word is that my perspective is it's always important to recognise the difference between what questions and how questions, and what questions pretty much are easier than how questions, and I think we've had some very rich contributions in relation to the how of how we can actually decarbonise our energy systems, for which I'd like you all to thank the panel in the usual way.